Emil, it's Emil Guillermo. Emil, Amok to you. How are you? This is Tuesday, show 195 of the show we affectionately call Emil Amok's Takeout, our takes on all things considerable. This is show 195. I mean, 195. Show 195. Are all the gizmos working? I think, yeah, I gotta just make sure all the gizmos are working. We're like 5 away from 200. My goodness, a lot happening, which is why we're here Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific Live, and you'll notice on your watch, Emil, it's 1:55. You're early. Yeah, we're typical model minority, right? Typical Asian. We're here ahead of time. No. It's You've discovered my secret, the lanyap, the little something extra we give you here on Emil Amok's Takeout. As I said, our takes on all things considerable. I call this the micro talk show of the AAPI and the AAX. Asian American Pacific Islander, AAX, the naming convention, X for your ethnicity, ALL because it's all's the rest of you, if none of you are in those aforementioned categories. It's the micro talk show because we zero in on the stuff that's important to Asian Americans. And like you should know it. I mean, we're all here. We're all here in this one big country. We're often ignored, often really not paid attention to. But I talk about the things like they matter. So today we're going to talk about this idea of anti-Asian bias in the San Francisco schools. I picked up the Wall Street Journal, and there was this guy, I think he worked for Bush, McGurn, talking about systemic anti-Asian bias, because he wants to use that term systemic, because apparently the liberals like to use systemic racism. Because if it's systemic, that's important. Well, systemic anti-Asian bias. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Lowell High School, my alma mater, of course, and not just because Try Harder has opened up in San Francisco, LA, and in New York City, but Try Harder is an interesting film, and the filmmaker doesn't get political, but I will, discussing systemic anti-Asian bias, Wall Street Journal, which in and of itself is systemic anti-Asian bias. We're going to talk about war because this is the day that lives in infamy, right? December 7th, 80 years after. And I just want to give an historical perspective about what happened on the West Coast 80 years ago and how you don't hear about it. I mean, okay, Pearl Harbor happened. Yes, we know about that. And we know that it began the backlash against Japanese Americans. But what we didn't know is that it divided Asian Americans too. I'll get into that. Get into the idea of war. I mean, on this 80th anniversary, there's a lot of saber rattling on both sides. Putin wants to go into Ukraine. Biden gets up and says, "Look, you go into Ukraine, you're going to pay the price." I mean, this is serious. But notice how we have at least a leader who will stand up and talk to Putin like it matters versus the other guy who, if you remember all the interactions with Putin from Helsinki to, all throughout that term, I was going to say the first term, but because it felt like so many different terms, but it was just one term. It's just so many monumental, catastrophic events that changed the norm of how politics and diplomacy works. But if you recall Helsinki and you go throughout how the previous president dealt with Putin, you got to be happy that the guy in there now is in there now and he's standing up to Putin, because that's exactly what needs to happen. I'll also talk about some obits. You know, I talk about Lowell High School a lot. I went to Lowell. That's my bias, right? Born in San Francisco, went to Lowell. But I just found out a couple weeks ago, or that a couple weeks ago rather, Joan Marie Shelley died. And Joan Marie Shelley, if you're a tried and true San Franciscan, you know that she was the daughter of Mayor Jack Shelley, the former mayor of San Francisco. And you also know that Joan Marie was more than just French teacher extraordinaire. You know, I took French in high school. I loved French. I was a Francophile, and all my best teachers were at Lowell High School in French. I mean, English too, because I spoke English. I know sometimes it's hard to, can't tell, but I had the best French teachers. Maybe it's because they could speak in French and they could say other things, or they could be as creative and critical about life and the country, and by speaking in French, or by giving you existentialist books or whatever. But my French teachers were among the best teachers at Lowell High School. I mean, there was Valerie Alexander. Boy, she was a great teacher. Or maybe they weren't great teachers, but they liked me. That's always important. If the teacher likes you. Sarah Trelon, she was great. And Joan Marie Shelley. I remember sitting in the front of her class just because I liked talking to her. That's the truth. My friends at Lowell were more the teachers than the students. It's weird, right? I mean, you know, you're 16, 17, and you're hanging out with teachers like they were your buddies, like they were your friends. Well, they weren't friends, but we were communicating at a different level. Just, they were mentors, they were teachers. And of course, I if you listened to me or heard me or read my stuff, you know I talk about Flossie Lewis a lot. Look her up, Flossie. She was profiled a couple of years back on PBS for just raging against the dying of the light. She's still at it. Flossie was probably my she was Lowell for me. But there were these other teachers who were also there because, you know, it's a full day there. Got to bug other people. And Joan Marie Shelley was it for me. I want to talk about her a little later on the show. And then another obit for Fred Hyatt. Now, I talked about Fred Hyatt yesterday a little bit, just because I saw it on the news that he had passed away. I think what bugs me about Fred Hyatt is that we're the same age. And people our age are dying, which means take care of yourself. Get off the statins. Do your bit. Exercise. Eat better. Do something. Try harder. But I communicated with a friend of mine who was at the Post, and he called Fred Hyatt a giant. Another writer who I respect has written a piece about him. He worked closely with Hyatt. And I just want, because the obituaries are coming in about Fred Hyatt, and I just want to read that in a bit. So all that coming up. here on this program, Emil Amok's take out the live stream. The live stream as opposed to Emil Amok's take out the podcast. And to show you the example, go to my Emil Amok column. Remember, I've written this column for like over 25 years. Emil Amok. Used to be at Asian Week in San Francisco. Now it's at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's at aldef.org/blog. So go there. You'll see my latest column, and you'll also see what I mean when I say, here's the podcast. There's a link to the actual podcast where you can go to your phone. If you have an iPhone, the purple button, click on the podcast button, and there you have it. And because I talked to the director, Debbie Lum of Try Harder. So read the column, listen to the podcast. I played a little bit of it here yesterday, just a little bit, like a minute or less. But listen to the podcast and you'll see the difference between the podcast, which is really kind of a conversation, and this, which is live stream. We do this live because who knows what we're going to get. We're live. We're live. That's always fun. Let's see Emil fall. No, it's live. I just don't know what's going to happen. Anyway, so let's begin. San Francisco Unified School District tonight, the board is having a meeting. They're going to discuss whether or not or what to do with the requirements to get into Lowell High School. There was some talk that they were going to get rid of merit-based admissions. They're just going to leave it up to a lottery. And I said, come on, San Francisco Unified School District, you got to try harder. You got to do better. That's lazy to go to a lottery. Because what does a lottery do? A lottery means you don't have time or didn't take the time to think about what would make it right at Lowell High School. See, here's the problem with Lowell High School. A lot of people want to go there because it has some prestige. It's got good teachers. It's got good offerings. You get the best of public high school. Public high school. You don't have to pay $50,000 a year, $30,000 a year. Catholic school prices are a little cheaper, except maybe SI might be $50,000 a year. And it's good. It's a good value, Lowell, when you start seeing the white kids from the prep schools. This was happening when I was there, and I was there in the 70s. The 70s, Emil. The 70s? You saw the Beverly Hillbillies first run? Is that it, Emil? Okay, look, I just want to say, like I said, it is a great public high school, Lowell. But when I grew up, I couldn't afford. My parents couldn't afford to send me to a private school. And so a good public high school, an elite public high school, benefits people like me, people like us, Asian Americans. So this idea that there's a systemic anti-Asian bias. Guy in the Wall Street Journal, big conservative blowhard, likes to say, oh, they're putting all these quotas on the school so that Asian Americans are limited. Oh, wait a minute. He's almost talking about like Asian Americans are the new whites. When schools were 100% white, we protested. 100% white, 100% anything is not good, not in a diverse country. a diverse society. And I think what's happening is that kind of rhetoric of here's systemic anti-Asian bias, it's fooling a lot of Asian Americans. A lot of Asian Americans are saying, hey, wait a minute, Emil. I don't like it where, my kid didn't get into Lowell. Forget about Harvard. Forget about all the elite schools. My kid didn't get into Lowell. Okay, well, what's the problem? Well, he had the grades, but they didn't have space. And that's the problem. We're talking about a resource problem. We're not talking about anti-Asian bias. We're talking about an anti-education bias. So what the conservatives want to do is they want to say, we should have a school that is 80% Chinese or 80% Asian or maybe even 100% Asian. If we score high that, in that way, we should all get in. That's merit. Of course, that's not the way it should be. But Asians buy into this. They forget that we are part of the great coalition that has brought equity and equality into public education. White conservatives love the division that this creates. Because it does. It makes Asian Americans forget that we are part of the civil rights movement. It includes us. So don't be fooled. We have benefited. But our fair share isn't 51%. It's not. And that's why when we get our fair share, you shouldn't see it as the white conservatives as, oh, look, here's systemic anti-Asian bias. No, we should look at it as, wow, we got a problem with education in this country, and we need more resources. We don't have enough resources. That's what it boils down to. Of course, both the liberals and the conservatives, I don't know if there are any conservatives on the school board, they don't know how to deal with this. They see, well, look, the Asians have taken the white conservative side, and the Asians are essentially being used as a human shield for the conservatives who are saying, look at this anti-Asian bias. And hey, it's self-serving. Asians say, yeah, we didn't get into Lowell. We need to get into Lowell. When what really should happen is the entire educational bureaucracy needs to take a good look at itself and figure out why people aren't getting in from diverse backgrounds at Lowell. Could it be that K through 8, they're not doing enough? They're not preparing students enough at the very earliest grades? I would say that's probably the case. I would look there, but no, we need immediate answers, because right now we've got Black kids and Latino kids at Lowell, and they're saying, hey, there are not enough of us. Well, yeah, because you got to go back to K through 8 and figure out why a small percentage of Black and Latino students are prepared to take on the rigors of Lowell High School. I mean, when I went to Lowell, ninth grade, I went to Everett Middle School, had my 4.0. I got in. I wasn't as prepared, perhaps, to continue on my 4.0, but I was competitive. But I got in. They're saying, look, forget about merit, forget about the test, forget about the grades. We're going to make Lowell like every other school. And that kind of bothers me. That kind of bothers me, because now you want to see where real racism is? Real racism is saying, we had this thing called Lowell, which was the best in public education. If you qualified and you were Black, indigenous, a person of color, you could get in and get the best public education. But we had some white conservatives complain that it was systemic racism against Asians, and the Asians agreed with them. And now we're going to take away this great public high school, neuter it, and make it just normal. You can get the same education at Lowell that you can anywhere else, and isn't that wonderful? No, it's not wonderful. Why? Because for someone like me and other people who, look, I don't want to say I was gifted. I was never in the gifted program. I mean, no one tapped me and said, you're gifted. But for high achievers or people who want to do more, there should be an opportunity in public schools, like the best public academic magnets, like Lowell. And so you take away Lowell and you've just homogenized high school public education and made it all kind of the same and eliminated truly what was one of the great experiences in my life, which was to go to Lowell High School, to be with the great teachers, like I mentioned, Mrs. Shelley, Mrs. Lewis. If you see Try Harder, you see they talk about Mr. Shapiro, I believe his name is, the physics teacher. He wasn't there when I was there. But the teachers are part of the experience. The student body, it's not quite as diverse. So if it's not quite as diverse, why don't you address diversity? Why don't you address diversity by going to the neighborhood schools and looking to see what they're not doing to prepare those students to get to Lowell? Because to go the opposite direction and say, well, let's look at what's wrong with Lowell, and okay, we're just going to dump the admissions tests and the merit-based admissions, and we're just going to let people in like it's a regular school and take away the distinction of being an excellent public education experience. And we're going to make it a lottery. A lottery. Imagine that. A lottery. That is lazy. A lottery suggests we don't have time to fix the problems of education. We'll leave it up to chance. And that's what the debate is tonight at the San Francisco Unified School District's Board of Education. They're going to talk about that. They're going to talk about going to a lottery system, getting rid of merit-based admissions. And you know what? I don't live in the district. I don't have a kid there. I'm just an alum. Alums don't matter. They're going to do what they want. And they're already hell-bent on wrecking Lowell High School. But I'm telling you, they think they're going to benefit people who yearn to go to Lowell but aren't ready to go to Lowell because their K through 8 experience was not great. Because whose fault is that? Educators, bureaucrats, the policymakers. I don't blame the kids. You can say, well, kids have strange home lives. They don't work hard enough. Well, who motivates them at school? That's what the problem is. I'm telling you, you get rid of Lowell and you get rid of a great equalizer for people who are just regular folks, can't afford $50,000 a year to send their kid. I think it's 50. I don't know. It's probably more to send their kid to Urban or Drew or Town or College Prep or Head Royce in Oakland or Miss Burke School or whatever, the private schools are now in the city. SI, St. Ignatius. You get rid of Lowell. Lowell was the equalizer. You don't realize that, but Lowell was the equalizer. You get rid of Lowell, and there are a lot of opportunities for people like me, sons and daughters of immigrants who lose out on an opportunity. I mean, I got into Lowell. I was lucky. I got into some very competitive classes. Those that I was competitive and good at, I did well. Those I didn't, well, it was learning experience. I still got into Harvard. I don't think I would have done that if I went to a neighborhood school. I wouldn't have been pushed to do more. And I really owe it to Lowell. I owe it to the environment at Lowell. When I saw my other buddies, my white buddies from Pacific Heights or from, the Richmond, I said, wow, if they're going to apply, why don't I? I did. That wouldn't have happened if I'm in the neighborhood school and no one's talking about college in that same way. That's the difference. You eliminate Lowell, you eliminate that kind of access to opportunity for a lot of poor kids. You think by lowering the standards at Lowell, you're making it easy for them to participate. Now they're at Lowell, but now they're in the less good Lowell. They're not in the Lowell that you see in Try Harder. Try Harder. Now that is a movie. And all right, so if you go to my ALDEF blog, aaldef.org/blog, you'll see the piece I wrote. Lowell High students try harder, but SF educators need to do better than eliminate merit. I talk about try harder because try harder is, I saw it at first, I wasn't into it because I thought, God, the director misses on the political part here. I mean, there are even people saying that they wanted to go to Stanford, but the people at Stanford were saying they were like machines and they didn't want them at Stanford, which to me sounded like, now that's systemic discrimination. Or, the teacher who tells the students right out that, hey, there's a reason why you guys aren't getting into schools. It's because you're Asian. That kind of blunt talk, I was thinking, well, she shows it. She doesn't get into it. And when I talked to Debbie Lum, I said, well, why didn't you get into that? And she says, well, I'm not political, Emil. I'm not an activist filmmaker. I'm a storyteller. And that's cool. I get it. Because what she does do, what Debbie Lum does do with Try Harder, is she shows the human and psychological drama of a Lowell High School college admission year. I mean, she really goes with these 5 kids. And don't think it's all Asian. 3 of the 5 are Asian. And in fact, maybe the student who's Obama-esque in the sense that she's, white father, black mother, staying with her single black mother. The black mother is more tiger mom than the Asian tiger moms. Although there's one tiger mom, Mrs. Kai, Alvin's mom, who we don't see it, but Alvin said, Mom, maybe you shouldn't have offered a red envelope to the college interviewer. He's trying to protect his mom, just as she's trying to be aggressive and protect her son. Now, there are a lot of touching moments in this film. And it shows what these kids go through, how they're professional students. And, I got to hand it to you. I ended up, I've seen the film several times now. I've written about it, and I'm convinced that it really shows you the problem with the college admissions process. And once again, we're dealing with resources. In my day, you can get into, you can get into an elite school. It was like you had a 1 in 10 chance. And right now, it's a fraction of that because everyone is applying. And with that common app, you got people applying to 20 and 30 schools. And right now, it's almost like schools and education. It's like a Louis Vuitton bag. You should have one. And not the knockoff that says LV on it, but it's a bag that says on the inside UC Riverside. You want the real thing. That's a problem. And I think when you see this movie, you realize, boy, why is it that we as educators I'm not the educator, but why is it the educational system beats down these kids? What does it prepare them for? Anxiety, depression, a lack of self-worth. Why is it that we don't build these kids up instead of tearing them down? And then these kids get through that junior, senior year. They have to live with their choice or live with what's happened. And I don't know if they ever find out that or ever learn that it's okay to be in the moment, to enjoy yourself, enjoy your year, your senior year, and not be anxiety ridden. Because I see how if you don't have good support, you can fall apart. I don't think that's really the goal of senior year. But our system kind of does that. So Try Harder, the movie, reveals all this and really tells us all that we need to try harder to make it better for our kids, our country, and as far as diversity and wanting to get a more diverse student body at Harvard or at Lowell, we got to go back to, well, not K through 8. We got to go back to pre-K and make sure kids are prepared for that kind of rigorous education if that's what they want. Anyway, tonight at the San Francisco School Board, they'll be discussing what to do with college admission or high school admissions at Lowell High School. I hope they keep it. You can go to my ALDEF blog and see what I've written. You can also go to, I wrote something at SF Gate earlier this year. I said, look, this is the crown jewel of high schools, public high schools. Without them, poor Black, Indigenous, people of color students would have no, unless they got a scholarship, I suppose, but what kind of shot would they have to go to town or go to Urban or Drew or any of those schools? Anyway, so check out the movie Try Harder. TryHarderFilm.com will tell you where it is, where it's showing. It's in New York, I think on Union Square in New York City, but only till the 9th. It's also in LA, only LA, and then San Francisco and Berkeley, only through the 9th. See if it's going to be held over, see where it's going to be. It's worth watching. And here's the other thing. it's not necessarily an Asian American film. It's done by an Asian American director. 3 of the 5 students who are profiled are Asian American. But as I remember asking Debbie Lum about this, and she said, I don't see race. This isn't about race. And in fact, when they were there filming, it wasn't about race. They didn't see the backlash, the anti-Asian backlash. There was none. So that was really informative to see that she had that experience, because she has put together something that really is truly a diverse profile of Lowell. And it should tell you not to be taken in by, these conservative rants in the Wall Street Journal, systemic anti-Asian bias. Lowell High School is not systemic anti-Asian bias. It's not. It is not. Asian Americans are part of the Civil Rights Coalition, and the battles for equity in public education have gotten us a great public education example like Lowell High School. If there are 51% of us there or more, that's more than our share. And now, what about the other kids, the Black and Latinos? Well, that's for the educators to figure out how to fix. So we talked about try harder, Lowell High. I told Debbie Lum, I said, Lowell was probably more important in my development than Harvard. Harvard was a different thing when I got there. And in the podcast, if you go to the ALDEF blog, aaldef.org/blog, and go to that Lowell High column, you'll get the click to the podcast, the recorded podcast. And she says, people don't talk about fit enough. They just want to get, they want to get to the Ivy League. They want to get to that great school, Stanford. They want to get to their choice. But no one ever thinks about fit. And I think that was sort of my understanding, or that's what happened to me. I went to Harvard, and it wasn't nearly the kind of place that fit me as I would have hoped. I made it mine. I did my Harvard things, but I guess it was my Louis Vuitton bag, just not a knockoff. But it wasn't really me either. So, okay, we talked about try harder. I talked about Joan Marie Shelley. Because while we're talking about Lowell, right? And I want to talk about Joan Marie because there was a line in the Chronicle obit that really got me. And I think it was Kevin Shelley. He said, Joan Marie loved to laugh. And I think that's what I loved about Mrs. Shelley. I mean, I love Mrs. Lewis, my English teacher. I spoke English. I didn't make her laugh so much as I made her kind of like, she kind of crinkled up her face at me a lot. With love, of course. But with Joan Marie, I'd make her laugh out loud, and I would sit up in the front with Bennett Freeman, my buddy who was a sophomore. I was a senior. So he looked up to me back then. And Mrs. Shelley was so great. I know that I wasn't the best student in class. And I know I probably could have done better. But she knew I was trying. And she made French fun. And she made it, I mean, we took it, let's see, I guess it was like 2:15 in the afternoon. She made French fun. And I remember I would bump into Mrs. Shelley because she became the union president, the teachers union president. And when I was in Washington, I remember going to a restaurant with my wife, and there she was dining alone. I said, well, what, Mrs. Shelley? I never called her Joe Marie. I always called her Mrs. Shelley. There she was. God, you know, I miss her. I mean, when I saw the obit, I said, that's why Lowell teachers are part of that experience. And Charlie Harder does talk, like I said, they have a teacher they talk to there. Mrs. Shelley. All right, let me talk about Pearl Harbor. And I'll finish off with Fred Hyatt. Because he was a Harvard classmate I didn't know. Now, how can you be a Harvard classmate and don't know him? Well, I didn't know Bill Gates either. He's a Harvard. I didn't know Yo-Yo Ma. He was a Harvard classmate. God, Emil. All those people you didn't know. Did you go to Harvard? Or are you like doing the correspondence course? No, I was there. It's just that it's a big place. You get lost. Anyway, I want to talk about Pearl Harbor because this is something that people don't get. And today is Pearl Harbor Day, and I want, you know, it's 80 years after that surprise bomb attack. And you might see it mentioned adjacent to today's news in Hawaii. If you're listening to us about Hawaii or in Hawaii, then you know, my goodness, there are floods, terrible storms, terrible rains. And I know this time in Hawaii, I lived there for 2 years. I was there when the Alawai backed up from rains, and that's rain and infrastructure. And when floods hit Kauai, now they're saying the flash floods are threatening Oahu. So this day, you're going to hear a lot of Hawaii news. But here's the thing about Pearl Harbor. Most people just know, okay, day that lives in infamy, right? By December 8th, Roosevelt declares war on Japan. I didn't usually get into the spirit of the war until Executive Order 9066. That's in February. That's when Roosevelt ordered members of Americans of Japanese ancestry to be incarcerated, along with Italian Americans and German Americans. But this is what I found out just a couple years ago. And it's from the scholarship and research of my good friend, the late Don Boholano Mabalan, Stanford-trained PhD, tenured professor of history at San Francisco State. What most people don't realize is that in California, so right after Pearl Harbor, you had people saying, oh, we're incarcerating the Japanese, or there's war. But there was an anti-Japanese sentiment that was beginning, and it culminated in the February incarceration order. But here's what happened that usually people don't get beyond. 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked the Philippines, laying the groundwork for full-fledged occupation of Manila, complete with a Filipino puppet government. At the time, There were like 40,000 Filipinos on the West Coast. And you see this thing happening with Pearl Harbor. Whose side are you on? And it's unfortunate that the Filipinos got real patriotic for Filipinos in the Philippines, as well as the United States. And same with the Chinese. So when Pearl Harbor hit, it was good for the Filipinos and the Chinese who got this patriotic fervor, but bad for the Japanese. This is what Don Mabalan wrote. Once seen as half-human, inferior savages, Chinese and Filipinos were suddenly America's allies, while the Stockton Japanese community immediately found itself the target of racist attack from their Asian neighbors as well as whites. We ganged up on the Japanese Americans, the Japanese Americans. It caused division. And a lot the same way that we see divisions forming over issues like Lowell High School. You know, to call it the Lowell High admissions. Keeping a cap on Asian admissions at 50%, that's systemic anti-Asian bias. No. It's like, all right, you got your fair share, Asian Americans. Let's try to figure out how to deal with this problem so everyone gets their fair share. So I just wanted to share that idea. I'll talk more about it tomorrow, but it's real. Pearl Harbor was a great unifying thing for some Asian Americans, but like I said, the Chinese, the Filipinos. But if you're a Japanese American, no, it was not. And a lot of the time, they were getting anti-Asian sentiments from other Asians. That is a little bit of history that few of us know. Okay, I want to read this. I've been a career journalist, TV, radio, web. David Vandrell is really one of the great writers at the Washington Post. And I want to read this about Fred Hyatt because he was, I called up a friend of mine who works at the Post, and I was just saying, God, I didn't know Fred. I think I sent him one letter in all of my career in journalism. And I've dealt with a lot of opinion editors, but not the Post. And maybe I should have. I sent him one letter, didn't hear back. He's busy. I did know Fred Hyatt's wife, Margaret. I just knew her freshman year. It didn't really know of each other much after, but freshman year is your first year. You meet everybody. So, and they're not obituaries so much as they are combination personal appreciations. They kind of tell you something about the man. They also tell you something about the Washington Post, which is a great paper. Here's my friend who was there I talked to yesterday. I said, God, I didn't know Fred Hyatt. He said, yeah, he was a giant. And this is from my friend who is a giant and who's won several Pulitzers in investigative journalism. And when he said it, it just stopped me. I said, well. So I'm going to read this, written by David Vandrell, a great writer who worked as one of Hyatt's pen of editorial writers. Among his many gifts, Fred Hyatt had a keen eye for young writers because they are young. His many discoveries must be forgiven for thinking that Fred was the greatest mumbler in Washington Post history. That title retired along with Walter Pincus, an invaluable national security reporter, who would have had twice as many scoops in his illustrious career if his editors had known what he was saying. Mumbler. Pincus asked me to lunch years ago when I was writing about the suicide of an important White House figure, and only as the check came did I realize he was telling me that he was the man's close acquaintance and played tennis with him shortly before his death. But runner-up is an achievement. Fred, who died on December 6th at the height of his powers, is the best opinion section editor in American journalism, was a master of the strategic mumble. Strategic mumble. The more important the information he had to impart, the fainter his voice became. With something really big, he would whisper 2 or 3 words and flinch as if saying so much had been painful, then complete his thought after a pause without moving his lips or tongue, which is not as easy as I make it sound. The effect was magical. What chocolate is to Hershey, Pennsylvania, words are to Washington, D.C. Yet Fred's whispery mumble made his words individually precious, like the feathery footprint of a Pleistocene huntsman on a windswept piece of stone. God, if I die and anyone ever says that about me, that would be great. Like a feathery footprint of a Pleistocene huntsman on a windswept piece of stone. So, David Vandrell, great writer, talking about Fred Hyatt. Lean in has become a cliche, but in Fred's company, it was position A. He literally had you half out of your chair hanging not on his words, but on breaths that might be words. They never disappointed. In breadth of knowledge, Fred was an encyclopedia. In laser insight, he was a philosopher. His wit was sharp and dry as James Bond's martini. As to his judgment, I have no figure of speech. I've never met anyone with better judgment than Fred. His critics say he misjudged the Iraq War. He came to agree. Actually, what he might have misjudged was the team that authored the war, whose failure to plan for post-invasion government remains shocking nearly 20 years later. Apart from that, where do his critics depart from his judgments exactly? They don't say that Saddam Hussein wasn't a tyrant. They don't say Saddam Hussein wasn't routinely shooting at the Allied planes, a sign to keep a safe space between him and his threatened neighbors. They don't say that Saddam Hussein wasn't playing chicken with the West, pretending to have weapons he did not actually have. Hussein was better positioned to prevent that war than Fred was. Fred's prominent critics on this judgment are a stopped clock caucus. Their dial was frozen in opposition to the administration, to American power, to military force, and like all stopped clocks, a moment arrived when they were right. There's an image of a stopped clock. Which brings me to something else about my friend and boss. Many readers assume that the job of an editor is to dictate outcomes, help one team, hurt the other. The rise of cable television and online platforms that embrace this model has fortified the image. As editor of the Post's opinion journalism for 22 years, Fred was the opposite of the stopped clock caucus. He questioned everything, starting with himself, and valued all candid voices. He understood the roomiest space in journalism today is the frontier of fair play. Boy, now that's a great phrase. He understood that the roomiest space in journalism today is the frontier of fair play. Hey, be fair and honest, right? Intelligent people grow tired of having their own ideas recirculated to them, like airplane air, or recirculated to them, like airplane air. Oh, wow, that's an image. Steadily depleted of oxygen. That is an image. Intelligent people grow tired of having their own ideas recirculated to them like airplane air, steadily depleted of oxygen. I guess reading David Randell's piece here on Fred Hyatt, I'm recirculating airplane air. Fred had faith that a marketplace of ideas will fill with customers. He died while building that marketplace, the cloister of a dozen monkish editorial staffers he inherited from his brilliant predecessor, Meg Greenfield, grew to more than 80 multimedia thinkers by the time of his death. He did not seek like minds, which was good because he was a unique mixture of firepower and humility. He sought honest minds. Because I live in the middle of the United States, a region where Donald Trump voters are, to borrow from Abraham Lincoln, as plenty as blackberries, Fred's whispery urgings to me usually involved his constant search for voices open to the former president's appeal. Even as Trump smashed the dishes in America's conservative kitchen, alienating one writer after another, Fred doggedly persisted in looking for interpreters and explainers who were neither paranoid nor grifting. Grifting, there's a word. Devin Nunes from California comes to mind. Trump, back to the article. Trump, with his knack for spawning odious imitators, made that a tough job. But the monotony of Trump critics made Fred uncomfortable. Fred Hyatt was a man of high standards that he applied foremost to himself. He was a champion of the oppressed, a clarion of freedom. I will miss his winsome mumble, which somehow echoes in my mind. Even more, I will miss the bell-like clarity of his example. I mean, is there any reason, is there any doubt why David Vandrell is one of the great journalistic writers of our generation, writing about Fred C. Hyatt, who led the Washington Post editorial page? I think I'm dwelling on Fred Hyatt because we were the same age. And we both went to Harvard, but he didn't go to Lowell High School. So we finish off with an obit with Fred Hyatt. This is Shelley. We got a couple other things I'll bring up tomorrow. Talk more about Pearl Harbor. We'll call it a day. Regular listeners to the show know that you get to this point of Emil Amok's Takeout, and this is where, hey, you made it this far. You belong. You really belong. And yeah, you're not. And I just want to say, give yourself a hug. Give yourself a hug of the. I like to hug the elbows. Hug the elbows. You belong. Feel it. Don't doubt. Don't doubt. We get meditative at this point. Sometimes it's easy to doubt. Sometimes it's easy to say, "Hey, I don't belong here." No, you do. You belong listening to the brown guy who stands in front of the darker gong. So, as I wish for me, I wish for you. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. And may you live with ease. Till next time. Emil Guillermo here. Mahal Kita.